I'm Beth Hyland. It is July 11th, 2012, and I'm with Tom Dimitroff at the Corning Museum of Glass. And Tom, can you tell us your full name?
Yeah, Thomas Philip Dimitroff. Philip's not used very often, but yes.
And when and where were you born?
I was born in Waverly, New York. My father was at Guthrie Clinic. He was Dr. Guthrie's chief intern. So we were in the valley. So that's what got me there.
Did your parents have any interest in glass, or were they collectors?
No, they didn't. My father was born in the old country, Macedonia, and you know, to him, unless something is 500 to 1,000 years old, it's not an antique, you know.
Absolutely.
And so that's why I'd bring home a nice piece of Steuben, and he'd say, "How old is that?" You know, and I'd say, you know, 1920, and he just shook his head. So, no, neither of them did. Right.
So what motivated, well, let me first ask, discuss your early education and your career choices.
Okay. I hate to say it, but I never made a career decision. I went, my first education outside of high school was at Lock Haven State College, which is primarily phys ed, physical education. And I wrestled, and I did gymnastics and track. And so I went there, and everything was going along pretty good. And then one day I got 3 concussions in a row. You know, back then they didn't, they told you to get up and walk it off. And the 3rd concussion, I ended up in the hospital. And so the doctors told me that I had better get out of any contact sports because, you know, so I came back to Corning here, and I got a job with Maury Dull driving ambulance. And I drove ambulance here until I decided to go back to school. I went to Mansfield and got my bachelor's degree, and then got my master's at Elmira College. And I've picked up other courses, different places.
Sure. And where did you begin teaching?
Began teaching, well, you know, we had student teaching. I did my student teaching in Athens, Pennsylvania. And I also did some work in Sayre, Pennsylvania with athletic teams. But the main, I came to Corning, my parents needed me, they were ill. And I got a job, and I retired 35 years later from the same building, same job.
That's wonderful.
I loved it, though. I just, it was a constant challenge, and the kids were good, and I said, why, if you're happy, why move, you know? And so that's what I did. And I retired, I think, about 10 years ago.
Okay.
So I've enjoyed it, and I've been able to spend a lot more time with you folks here at the museum and the library, and what a wonderful opportunity to grow up in a town where they have the facility here. The best people, the best curators of glass, and the best library people, and I just count my lucky stars very often for being here. Yeah.
Well, you've really contributed by doing a lot of glass research.
Well, yeah, and I think that again, how would you not be excited about doing something with the tremendous resources that are available here? The first big thing came along in back in 1976, the bicentennial
Right.
of the United States. There were all kinds of things being done, and Corning Glassworks, Corning Inc., decided that there had not been a good history of the area written in over 100 years, probably close to two. And so they decided they'd like one, and they came to me and said, any chance you would do one? And I said, yeah, but I said, it's too big a job for one. So I asked my colleague that I taught next door to, Lois Janes, who's a very, very bright and very knowledgeable person, and I asked her if she would do the project with me, and we were off, and it was wonderful because if you've taught something for 20 years, you still don't know whether you can do it. You know, I could teach history, but could I research and write history? And that's the question that motivated me to do it. And so Lois and I began, we foolishly thought we could get done in 1 year. And so our arrangement was that you could have half a year off with pay, and then that was it. So we neither of us could afford to go another year without pay, so Corning picked up our salaries for that time, which was pretty nice. They also did some of the editing, and one of the funniest things that happened is a young guy that was editing for us, I wrote a chapter that included the strike at Corning and some of the things like that, and that hadn't really been written before. And thank goodness when we had to sign our paper to do it, I had a ad that Lois and I had complete control over content. Well, this gentleman read that, and he was kind of nervous about, and so he came in the next time we met, and he said, now I looked at that chapter again, and he said, there are 1,200 words on the strike and only 300 words saying good things about Corning. And I said, hey, that's the way it is. And I said, I don't know about you, because he's young. I said, I never really appreciated the company, Corning, until I wrote this book. I always thought Corning was simply this wealthy, company that just had always been wealthy and always would be. But then when you research and you find that they went bankrupt in the 1870s, and there were all the problems every other, company in America has. The difference is that they solved them better than most. And of course, the big difference is that the Houghton family was there. And first of all, one of the things that hit me was that the Corning Company is over 150 years old, and that's amazing for an American company.
Yeah.
And then when you add to it that it was run by management that for the whole 150 years that were members of the Houghton family, and they were in 5 generations of the Houghtons. And to me, I'm very sad because there is no Houghton now that wants to take over. So for the first time, we're out of Houghtons. And the second thing that I'm sad about is that we lost Steuben.
That's right.
So I think those 2 things are a bit sad. If you know, some of us that are old, you get you get kind of liking the way things are, and big changes are. Then, but anyway, so there were no problems with the book. The people and the company were absolutely wonderful. And I'll tell you an interesting thing. Maybe you can find out. But the book was published by the Bicentennial Commission, and they got all the proceeds. You know, Lois and I signed it off to them. So the idea was that they would put the money in the bank, and in 100 years, you know, there should be a big batch of money there.
Yeah.
But I don't know where that money is now.
Oh,
So
interesting.
nobody ever told me, but I'm assuming it's in a bank somewhere, growing by leaps and bounds, and getting ready for the next 100-year celebration. So
Now, it has been a huge success with the community. You went through another printing at least.
yeah, and it is, and it feels good to have people come up and say they've enjoyed it and everything. There is a danger about writing local history because, you know, you're right in everybody's back door, and I found that there were a lot of people were either upset because you put their uncle in and said something about him, or others were upset because you didn't put their uncle in or their grandfather or so on. But bottom line was a wonderfully good experience. And Lois and I we went to Albany and worked in their rare book section, and you know, just had some really great experiences. Yeah.
And you used this as a text when you were teaching?
I did, and so did Alan Hansey, who was one of the teachers of the same grade, and we found it very, very interesting. Actually, you could teach American history from this book.
That's true.
You know, I forget who it was, but he said something that always really impressed me. He said that if you want to start studying American history, and you go to Plymouth Rock and you look through a telescope and see Plymouth Rock, he said, you're starting at the wrong end. What you should do is turn the telescope around and look at the community and start and understand what happens in all these towns,
Makes sense.
and then put it together. And that influenced me in the book. I was really frightened about what if I made mistakes in it, and one of our editors, content editors, was Dr. Herb Wisby. I don't know if you know Dr. Wisby, an awful nice man. He he taught history courses at Elmira. He wrote a book that was a very good book on one of the gals that were involved in the settlements in the 1800s. Oh, I can't remember who it was, but anyway, it was a good book. And I said to him, what's gonna happen if I make mistakes? And he said, now you've been doing research and you've been reading those old books that were written 100 years ago. He said, do you find mistakes in them? And I said, oh yeah. And he said, what do you do? And I said, oh, I usually get a good laugh at it. And he said, just think, you're provided another 100 years of people can look for mistakes and laugh when they find them. So, and I have been told about a few.
That's a great attitude.
Yeah. So yeah, it is, and it's fun, and I learned a lot. When we wrote this book, we did not have a home, computers.
That's right.
And so everything, was had to be, if you had to retype a section, you had to retype the whole thing. And then when it came to the indexing, and I believe any book is only as good as its index. I mean, especially nonfiction. It's only as good as its index. And so what we did, we got a bunch of shoe boxes, and we got pads. I think we got them at Painted Post Press at the time, that just fit in those shoe boxes. So we would turn it to a beginning page, and then we'd find a word that we thought should be indexed. And then you put the word and where it is and line and everything, and then you put it and you alphabetize them. And then when you get all done, you have to go through and pick all the same ones. It was that was not a fun part of the book, but it was good. One other thing you might be interested in, we did, is there weren't a lot of photographs available back then. Yeah. And I think you folks did something like this, but what we did is we got a grant, and with the grant we bought a van, an old van, and we equipped the van with everything needed to copy pictures.
Oh, nice.
And what we found is people that had pictures were very frightened to bring them to the museum. They're afraid they wouldn't get them back. So what we decided was, if you tell us you've got the pictures, we'll jump in the van and go to you and take the pictures of copy whatever you have. And that worked wonderfully. And we got lots of the pictures are in there. That's how we got them. And both the Patterson Inn has a wonderful photo collection now. Yeah. So that was that book.
So how did this spur your interest in glass, or did that?
Yes. Lois and I would sit down and say, who wants to do this chapter? And when that chapter came, the chapter on the industrialization of Corning and the coming of the glass industry, and I was really fascinated with that. So I read it, and I just wanted to know more, and began working here and talking to people who had, been in the glass industry, and then that ended up in the book on Frederick Carter and his glass. So after the one on the history of Corning, I said I'd never do another book. After the Carter book. I said I'd never do another book. And I'm doing another book right now. I'm working to co-author with Dr. Greg Merkel.
Nice.
And but I think we've got a problem. He's got about 400 pages or more without photographs.
And that's all on the
And
analysis
I'm
of
doing
Carter's
about
glass.
15 chapters. So I think it's got to be a volume 1, volume 2, or just 2 books. I'd like to see it volume 1, volume 2, but time will tell.
And this
Yeah.
is on Frederick Carter and his...
It's on, yeah, it's going deeper than any of the other books have. I like to think there are 2 really major books on Carter, and the one was written by Paul Vickers Gardner, who worked with Carter for a while, and it's a wonderful book. It's a history book, and then it first one to really go in and begin to analyze what Carter was all about. And I knew Paul very well, and we worked on some things together. And so when I decided to do this book, my first guide was, I will not have anything in here that Paul has in his.
Aha.
So that this book will not be, a newer update of Paul's. It's things that were not available. Now, unbelievably, I have right now, I think, 4 different collections of done by either Carter. One is done by a gentleman that did most of the acid cutting work.
Ooh.
And there's another one that is done by a glass designer that worked at Steuben. And I've had their notebooks and their drawings and everything. So the book will have those in them. The book will have a lot of things that we didn't know exist. And when the book's over, the material will come here.
Wonderful.
So, yes. Yeah.
The Rakow Library has been very grateful for the
yes.
materials you've given us.
We'll
museum as well.
we'll keep doing it. I brought some things I had yesterday, I thought, but I'll bring them in tomorrow because I'll be here working tomorrow. Yeah. So what this book did to me again is emphasize the fact that Corning is a very special company. It's special. It's Fortune 500. It's also, as I said, 150 years old. And then we have this generation situation with the family, the Houghton family. And do you mind if I just talk about that for a minute?
That's wonderful.
Okay, Amy Houghton Sr. was the first Houghton. And he got his hand in a couple of glass industries in Corning, or in New England. And he pretty much ruined them. He was not a very, very good business person. But he felt he had a calling to do, work in the glass industry. And so he went to, he sold the companies in New England, and he went to Brooklyn and bought the Brooklyn Flint Glass Works. And can I run or jump around
Absolutely.
a little bit? I found that there were three events in the history of glass. that if you found them and put them in where they should be and remembered them, that it helps you clear up, the whole business. Now the one goes way back in the time of the Romans, and that is the discovery of glass blowing.
Okay.
Prior to that, glass was done by the core form method. So this revolutionized glassmaking. Then along came an Englishman. I never can get the dates straight, but I have them here somewhere. Along comes this Englishman named George Ravencroft in 1676. He developed what we now call lead glass. And lead glass was much heavier, much softer to be engraved, and it had all kinds of good qualities. And then the last thing, if you can remember, is in the 1820s here in America, and that was the development of mechanical press for making glass. That means that you now can leave behind your hand making of glass and become mechanized.
Right.
Now, I don't know whether it's a good example or not, and I hope it doesn't upset anybody, but I think an example I can give you of that is the Libby Glass Company. Back in the 19th century and the early 20th century, they made magnificent cut glass. Magnificent. They also made fantastic art glass of many different times. But if you want to see what Libby is making today, you go downtown and buy some tumblers that are very cheap, and on the bottom will be the Libby mark. That's what happened when glass companies decided to stop working by hand and going with mechanization. And it was interesting with Corning. I mention this if I may. Under the original Amory Houghton Sr. that started the company, he believed very strongly in the hand craftsmanship in making things, and hired very, very competent, gaffers. Now, his son, he had two sons actually. He had Amory Jr. and Charles. And actually there was a third, Theodore. I don't know if you ever heard of that. That was a very sad thing. He had some, I think, problems of probably, if he lived today, they would be treating him for depression. And he had an argument with his brother one day and stomped out, and they found him the next day. He had shot himself in one of the sheds of the glass works. So again, wealthy families have tragedy too.
Right.
And I guess it's how you handle it is the best. But anyway, Charles and Amory were just the opposite of their father. They were extremely talented. They knew what they wanted. Both of them worked very hard, but even so, because of their fathers, the company went bankrupt. Now, the Brooklyn Flint Glass Works, when it came to Corning, became the Corning Flint Glass Works. And what most people don't realize is the word flint means lead. So here we are back to our thing in the 1600s with George Ravencroft. The Brooklyn Flint Glass business was in the business of making art glass and things like that with high quality lead blanks they'd start with. Now, and this was true when they came to Corning. And in Corning, and it was Amory Jr. that was really the brain, he saw the importance of the growing railroad industry.
Okay.
You see, Corning is a natural crossroads. You can go back to the path system of the Iroquois Indians, and the north, south, east, west main trails crossed right here. Well, actually in Painted Post.
Yeah.
That's the way it got its name. There was an Indian post with pictographs on it where the two trails crossed. And it's a natural thing. So then when automobiles came, the two major routes crossed right here, east and west. Now they're going to be big highways. I forget the numbers, but it used to be Route 17 and Route what?
15. Yep.
And they crossed right in Painted Post. And the trains, the same thing. Corning got two east-west trains that went from New York to Buffalo, right through the southern tier. The first one was the Erie, which came, I think, in the 1840s. And then a person competing with the Erie was the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western. The Erie came through the south side of the city, right up what is now Denison Parkway.
Okay.
And the DL and W went on the north side. And then the old railroad that was built, it was for the coal in Blossburg. That railroad was purchased by the New York Central, and they added to it so that it went going south. It went from here to Wellsboro, down the Grand Canyon to Williamsport, and northways it went up to Syracuse. So you see, we have that important, and I think that's a part of the success of some of the companies that came to Corning, because that's a tremendous thing to both ship goods out and get them in. And I think that's something very important to think about when you think about what's happened in Corning. And you look at that new traffic thing. I can remember four where the first one was the routes. The routes came right into
Painted Post.
Painted Post. You're probably too young, but there was a restaurant that had a big chicken on the top, a sign. I always remembered that. But then the second was they made, it was awful. It was an oval, and you came in on it, and
The
no
traffic
stops,
circle.
and
Yeah.
just I remember that. That was too many people hurt. And I forget what the next one was, and then there's this one. So that's a very, very important thing. Now, are there some other things? I've been going too much.
Well, you've been talking about the Houghtons.
Yeah.
So you got partway through
Going
talking
back to the Houghtons.
and the railroad.
Yeah,
glass.
it's an amazing thing that each of the generations there were people at the Houghtons that were powerful, brilliant, people that could take hold and go on. And again, the dates kind of get messed up, but the first Houghton, of course, was the Amory that brought the company here. And he passed away, and the ruling or the running of the company went to his son and Junior, Amory Jr., and Charles. And they were both brilliant. Amory kept coming up with new methods of dealing with the glass and making things, and Charles worked more in the chemical aspect of it. But I mean, and as I said, they saw the importance of latching on to the development of the railroads. And there were a couple problems the railroads had that they hadn't been able to solve. One was that the lenses that they bought them from lots of different companies, but the lenses for the different, semaphores and so on, that the ridges that gave the bouncing of the light, those were on the outside of the lens, and dirt would get on them, and they couldn't see. So I think it was Charles that developed a lens with that corrugation on the inside. Simple, but it gave Corning almost a monopoly on those lenses. Now, the second problem was that you had maybe 100 companies doing business with the railroads. And each company had their own color red and their own color amber, and it was awful. You couldn't see, you couldn't determine at a distance whether it was red or amber, and and so again, Charles and Amory Jr. got on it, and they went to Cornell and got some help at Cornell, and that was the beginning, by the way, of Corning going for scientific help.
Interesting.
And that led to the beginning of the whole wonderful facility they have up on the hill. And Corning was one of the earliest companies to have their own laboratory. And some pretty powerful men came there, Dr. Littleton and, all the others. Well, anyway, they developed this wonderful, wonderful red and amber, and they built a big, I wish I could have been there, they built this big wooden contraption, and they put it up on 3rd Street, I think. And then they went up the valley toward Watkins Glen,
Oh, yeah.
and they could differentiate the colors from a mile, 2 miles, and the International Railway Association made the Corning colors the colors for all the railroads in the country.
The standard.
And
wow.
boom, And Corning seems to always be 1 foot ahead. It happened with the light bulbs, and before we started, I mentioned that most companies would be just so happy if they did something that profoundly affected people's lives forever. And here, Corning, those lenses did, and then they made the light bulb, the first light bulb, and now the different types of transmitting things. It's just an amazing story. Now, going on with the with the Houghton dynasty, Amory had two children, Arthur A. Houghton and Alanson B. Houghton. And Alanson, I think that's the way it's pronounced, is it?
I think so.
Alanson served 2 terms in Congress.
Wow.
And it caused a problem because Alanson was in Congress and his brother, Arthur A., got very ill. And so they had to they called in a man from Elmira, Mr. Falk, and he actually ran the company. He ran it for, I think, about 2 years. 2 years.
Interesting.
Well, Arthur Houghton and Alanson had a child named Amory, which is the one we call the ambassador. And Amory was ambassador to France. His father, Alanson, had been ambassador to Germany and England.
Wow.
So, you know, that's an amazing thing. And then Amory Houghton, the fourth generation, had 2 boys, Amory Jr. and James. And they're the last 2. And I'm right now working on, in my book, I'm having a chapter on the Houghton generations and what each gave mainly to our city, because they're very giving people. So that's going to be a chapter that I don't think you find anywhere else, where in one chapter we look at it and see that that dynasty of 5 generations of all being successful.
And all their contributions.
Yeah, it's just amazing. And we should also, Arthur A. Houghton had a son named Arthur A. Houghton Jr. And it's Arthur A. Houghton Jr. who took over Steuben from Frederick Carter, and I believe 1931, and changed Houghton a great deal. Arthur was probably the richest of all the Houghtons, and in a way he was very, very generous. He started the rare book collection at Harvard University. He was on the governing board of Harvard. He was on the board of the Metropolitan Museum. He was quite a guy, and his influence on Steuben was absolutely amazing because he changed it greatly, and that's a whole nother story we could go on. But any other area that I see we're a little short on time here, but
Well, it depends upon how long you want to continue.
oh, I'm fine.
You're
I'm
fine? Okay.
Yes.
Ryan, should we keep going, or?
Are you all
Okay.
right?
I'm all right.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, then there's a couple things we could go. Go ahead.
Well, you said you were
Check my batteries here.
great.
Oh, okay. I know one thing I'd like to mention.
Yeah, we should be good. Just not.
Too much longer.
Okay.
Good.
Talking about mechanization, the Arthur Amory Sr., the guy that brought the Corning Flint Glass Works here, he was very, very anti-mechanization. He wanted the company to continue to be a Flint Glass Works and make things, the men make it by hand. Now, an example of that, because his 2 sons, Amory Jr. and Charles, also seemed to want to keep the picture of the glass, the gaffer blowing glass. That was what they wanted. But the world was changing.
Yeah.
And to give you an example, when Corning was able to make the first light bulb, and they got that business, they made all the light bulbs by hand, a two-man team to make a light bulb. And those teams could make 2 bulbs per minute.
Wow.
Now, the Corning Company not only looked at product, but they also always were looking at process, how we can do it better. And that led to the development of one of the greatest machines made in North America, and that's the ribbon machine. And with the ribbon machine, mechanization, we go from 2 bulbs a minute to 300 bulbs a minute, or 18,000 bulbs an hour on the ribbon machine. And so they installed the ribbon machine in Wellsboro, and they made the bulbs there. And prior to that ribbon machine, by 1910, working by hand, blowing bulbs by hand, they had made 34 million bulbs.
Wow.
Blown them by hand. I mean, think of the number of skilled people you had, and that would be extremely hard to do that every day and know you had to make so many every minute.
And have them just to spec, yeah.
Right, yeah. I think I mentioned I did work at Corning.
Yes.
I have had a lot of jobs. I worked in Mansfield, Pennsylvania, in a foundry, and I was iron poor, and that was tough work. I also worked out of Corning here on the New York Central Railway, and I was a Gandy dancer, and we took care of the track from here to Geneva. That was an interesting job. And I don't know what I also drove ambulance, but I decided I should try to work in the Corning, in the plant.
Yes.
So I went over and interviewed. They were looking for people. So they hired me, and I can't remember which, A factory or B, but it's where they had these big automatics, they're called. And it looks like a huge round table.
Huh.
And it has on the table molds. Like the first day I was there, they were making pie plates, you know,
Okay.
and there was a mold. And that the machine, the table moves, and every time it moves, something happens to it. Like the empty mold is here and goes chunk, and hot glass goes in it, and then chunk, and the plunger hits it, and then it's fire glazed, you know, all the way around, and then it comes around, and there's an automatic takeout. It's looks like a pipe, a stainless steel pipe, and then on the end is this pad of asbestos, and there's a hole in the center because they can create a vacuum. So they put that on the plate. The vacuum takes over, pick it up, and put it on the they have a belt. So they finally said, you're going to work on a different machine, same type of machine, but it was making headlight lenses,
Okay.
3T headlight lenses. And I said, I guess I can do this, you know, all I got to do is stand here and watch it. And he said, yeah. And he says, now, the headlight lenses, the automatic takeout misses quite a bit because it has to go down on that thin edge of the...
Sure.
And so they said it misses. Now, when it misses, they said, you let it go and let it go over and let a chunk of hot glass go in it. But then they said, you gotta push this button to stop the plunger. If you don't, it'll ruin the plunger and it's $10,000, you know. And then after it goes through the plunger, you just let it go, and when it comes around to you, you have a pair of tongs, you just go into the hot glass and drop it in the cullet chute right by us. You know, and went downstairs and would be remounted. So, should be able to handle that. So, I sat there, and all of a sudden, the automatic takeout missed one, you know, and I thought, no problem. So I went up and didn't stop the plunger, and it went around, and everything's fine. But then it got to and missed to. And I started going, you know, and it was awful. The automatic takeout didn't work. It would maybe miss 3, get 4, miss 5, you know, and I'm doing this, and all of a sudden, boom, the machine stops. And it's the foreman. And I said, what's wrong? And he said, turn around. So I turned around. And here was a set of pallets, you know, wooden pallets, piled up all the way to the ceiling, burning, just burning. And there was another pile of pallets on the other side burning. And all the guys that worked there were hiding behind things, and the whole floor was covered with glass smashed. And what happened is I got so flustered that when I grabbed a piece to, instead of putting it in the cullet, I threw it over my shoulder. And I about burned the place down, you know. And the foreman called me in, and he said, you know, in the new contract, he said, we have something called voluntary layoff. And he said, I think that might have been made for you. And so I took voluntary layoff. Now, supposedly, that means if I want to come back, I get put up there. But I think enough years have gone by. But that was my second day that happened. So my career there was 2 days. Yeah. So I'm going to stay in the library and in the museum. Yeah.
But enough to get a taste for glass,
Yeah.
which has gotten into your blood
Yes.
in a different way.
Yeah. Yeah. And the challenge is still there. It's the same as I work with Dr. Merkel, who's up in the research
Sullivan, yeah.
development part. And Corning is always finding new ways to solve problems with glass. And often they will develop a glass product that has certain characteristics and not have any use for it.
Yeah.
And it'll sit on the shelf, and then maybe 20 years later, along comes, whoa. You know, when they first came out with I forget what it's called, but it's like a wire, and it has light goes
The
through
fiber
it.
optics.
When
yeah.
they first had that, the only thing they did with it is they used it on motorcycles. One end would go inside where the
handles?
backup light,
Okay,
or
yeah.
the light was, and the other went up and on the next to the speedometer,
Okay.
and you know that was red, and if your tail light went out, then you saw right away. And on a motorcycle, that's pretty important
Yeah.
at night. So they used it for that, but now it has all kinds of so it's just wonderful to be in a town that that still believes in their product like they do here, and they've gone into ceramics, and it's just it's an exciting place.
I agree.
Yeah, it's a very exciting place. And I can remember when I got my master's degree. Oh, I was so proud. And I found out a little later that I was the only guy on the street on where I lived that didn't have a doctorate degree. All my neighbors had doctorate degrees, and I thought, well, so. But just think of that, to live in a town where
It's
you
exceptional.
have that. And then obviously, one of the biggest problems that Corning faces, and all the Houghtons that have led the company have faced it, is how do you recruit the best scientists, the best engineers, the best managers who are in Seattle and Los Angeles and New York and all these wonderful cities. How do you get them to Corning, New York?
That's right.
Well, one thing is you have to make the community something special.
Right.
And example, Market Street. Now, the Market Street Restoration Agency, which has been fully funded by the Corning since it was made, tremendous amount of money Corning puts into keeping that street. And it is a nice street. It's different. And so they want to have the best school system. They want to have everything be the best. And living in a town where that is the thing that rules, it's important. Everybody I talk to outside that I talk to who are not Corning people, like the old Elder Hostel, it's now, I forget what, but it's
Rhodes Scholars.
Rhodes Scholars. When I get done talking, they always say, is Corning a company town? And of course the answer to that is, what's your definition of a company town? If it's what the coal mines back in the early 20th and the late 19th centuries, the coal mines in those towns where the coal miner got his check, and by the time he paid all the things for his house and everything, he didn't have any money. That's a company town. Another one I said to him was Hershey, Pennsylvania. The street lights are Hershey Kisses, and I don't know if you noticed, but the policemen have chocolate brown uniforms. And I said, so that proves that we're not a company town, because I can't think what our police would look like in crystal uniforms. You know. So, but we are a company town in the sense that we have one large company, and as people have said, I forget which way it goes, but if the company sneezes, everybody in Corning gets a cold. But the thing is that the leadership of Corning has always been a Corning person. They are all of the Houghtons, except one or two, have been born in Corning. They spend their life in Corning, and they all have seen to it that Corning is this, this special place.
Yes.
The parks that they have made, and we could go on and on. So yeah, it is a company town in the very, very best sense of the word.
But it also takes a lot of the community members, and
Oh.
you have participated in all kinds of historic preservation
Yeah.
projects to help contribute to making Corning better.
Yeah, and historic preservation is a hard thing. I worked on the Market Street Restoration Agency, and I'm now chairman of the Historic Preservation Commission for the city. And all of our work so far has been on Market Street. It's all the commercial district. And my dream as chairman of that commission is to see us begin to look at some of the homes in some of the neighborhoods that are so wonderful.
Yes.
And we have to remember that no matter how much money is spent on Market Street, and no matter how much beautiful Market Street is, it isn't the city of Corning.
Yeah.
It's one aspect of it. And I believe if we want Corning to stay and be as good as Market Street, we've got to start paying attention. We have too many absentee landlords that are, putting people in and just not caring about it. It was like I never thought that would happen in Corning, but it has.
Yes.
And if I'm as chairman of that group, I'm going to work as hard as I can so that we can begin to identify places that need to be preserved
Good.
or kept as they are. And I think if Corning can do that and say our neighborhoods are as important as anything else and begin to do our work with that. And I think my wife has gotten the city of Corning. I might be saying this too quickly because the city council meeting's coming up Thursday, but they're going to support a plan that she has developed to restore Courthouse Park to what it used to be with paths and so on and so forth. So
That's exciting.
yeah, it is, and it's the projects that are going on in Corning. There are just so many of them, and the biggest one, of course, is the hospital.
Right.
And the question is, when the hospital goes, what are they going to do with that piece of land that is so key, especially to some of us that are not close neighbors. So I don't run out of things to do in Corning, New York. It's a great place.
Anything else you want to talk about while we're conversing?
Well, I think that I had a couple things here that I'll just look at. Is that the lead glass thing, because Corning Incorporated grew by making all kinds of different things. Lenses, glass tubing, all kinds of things. And they became not mainly a flint glass company.
True.
They developed their Pyrex glass right on time so that when the source of medical and technical glassware, which always came from Germany, but when World War I broke, we had Pyrex.
That's right.
And it, it's still used to make beakers and things. So kind of got ahead of myself on that, but I think that the ability of Corning to go through the flood of '72, to go through, they went bankrupt. They had a strike. That's something I'd like to mention. When the union started to get active, the glass industry fought unionization harder than any other industry because most of them at that time were working with flint glass and they were blowing it with skilled blowers. And if they had to pay those men union wages, they would be out of business. So they fought it. They had to deal with strikes. But the most amazing thing is, and by the way, Corning Glassworks used to work closely with Dorflinger and Pearpoint in making sure that if a person got fired at Pearpoint, that they wouldn't get hired in Corning. You know, the workers had reason to be concerned. But anyway, I was reading a book by Arthur Houghton, the one that took over Steuben in 1931. And he says in that book, and I've always believed this, and I put it in the book, and I'm going to put it in the new book, and he says that very clearly, he says the reason Amory Sr., the original, moved his company from Brooklyn to Corning was union problems. Yeah. And Corning was very strongly anti-union. Frederick Carter was anti-union. And you know when Corning got unionized? 1942 or 3.
Wow.
And that was because the federal government had a regulation that only union shops could get government contracts.
Oh, interesting.
So Corning got its union, but Corning has never had a strike since it became unionized. Never had a strike. So there was one other. There's another minute.
I think so.
We're still okay?
I just got to get the date, and then we can go on that. Well, I don't have it here, but a group of men went into Mr. Houghton's office to ask for a raise, and he fired them all. He said, if you had come on in individually, I would have talked to you. But being a group, it's too much like, too much like a strike. So they did have a strike. The union that wasn't here came in, and the American Flint Glass Workers, and there was a strike. The American Flint Glass Workers saw to it that all the Corning boys that lost their jobs got jobs in one of the glass houses in the Midwest, Ohio, or even down in the South. But, Ohio, Pittsburgh, West Virginia, that was a big triangle of glass making. So they made sure that they got jobs. And back then, in the summer, usually June or July, they closed down the glass factories because they had to remake the tanks. Yeah. So they just closed them right down, and it gave the workers a summer vacation. And when the company out west in western, Pennsylvania and so on, closed down for the summer, there were, I forget, 20, let's say, Corning boys, and they were young, 16, 18.
Wow.
They rented a railroad car to go to Corning for, see their families and everything. And what turned out it was an old wooden car they rented, and it was put on the back of the train. And so they had to go on a siding, and somehow things got messed up, and a fast freight ran right into the back of that train, and it killed all those boys. Well, the American Flint Glass Workers Union thought, okay, now's our time. We're going to make martyrs out of all those boys, and we'll have a monument made. And then what we'll do is when we'll have the annual convention of the American Flint Glass Workers Union in Corning.
Wow.
And we will, part of our meeting, we will unveil our monument. And so they talk about something I think is funny. I always laugh every time I think about it. But the time came for the Flint Glass Workers Union's annual meeting. No monument. There was a strike at the monument workers. So anyway, the monument finally came. Have you seen it?
Yes, I have.
Jenny Monroe didn't know it was there. I mean, most Corning don't. There's a row of trees. It's in the Catholic cemetery, and it's a beautiful monument, and it has kind of an upside down C, and all the boys' names and ages are there, and then it tells about it. And on top is a gaffer with his blowpipe, and it used to have glass on the end, but that's gone. But it's a very important monument because it was a hard time. It was a hard time for the workers, and it was a very hard time for management. But boy, the Houghtons stood strong, and they did not want anybody interfering with the way they ran their company. And I think they did it pretty well without any, the Houghtons were so, maybe you've heard the story. I can't remember whether it was our Amo or his father, but at Christmas time used to go through and shake hands with everybody in the factory and know most of their names. And they had the annual dinner where people were given, pins for their length of
Service,
working.
yeah.
And those were really nice affairs. I had a box of things just yesterday, and I picked it up, and there's a 50-year pin. And the 50-year pin is gold, real gold, with a diamond in the middle.
Nice.
And some of them had garnets at different years. So it's a company that knows the importance of the community it's in, and hopefully it's a community that knows the importance of having the company.
Yeah.
And for all these years, that's been the story. And I just hope it continues. I wish we could find a Houghton somewhere that we could have. But
Well,
I have
thank
talked
you.
enough, I think, haven't I?
Well, you have certainly gone through a wide range, and I thank you very much. And your book helps document a lot of those stories.
And I love talking about it, and I think we're, as I said earlier, we're very lucky. We're very lucky. I mean, there are problems, and there are things that some of us wish would go another way. But when it's all said and done, it's a very nice community.
I agree.
You know, it's wonderful, and it's because I think of the relationship between the company and the community. We forgot one thing, but I won't do it 'cause it's too late. But in 1868, when Mr. Houghton came, if I just tell this quick story, and then we'll see. But when Mr. Hungerford, a guy from Corning, went to see Mr. Houghton about making these glass blinds, he also said to Mr. Houghton, you know, Corning, where I live, is looking for an industry. And Mr. Houghton said, hey, I've been looking, you know, I want to get out of Brooklyn. I owe so much money, and the union's after me. I want to get out. And so they made a deal, and Mr. Houghton thought that Mr. Hungerford would never do it. But he said, we will move our company to Corning if you raise your $50,000.
Wow, a lot of money.
And, yeah, and lo and behold, Hungerford raised it. And so Mr. Houghton's, when he heard that they'd raised the money, he got scared. He thought, what have I done? You know, I'm going to move my company from New York City to the wilds of western New York. You know, they probably thought there were Indians still here. He was really, really upset about that. And here's where I think he had his most brilliant move as a business person. Right next door to him was a business which was a what we call a cold making. They did not make glass. They bought glass, and then they cut it and engraved it and decorated it. It was run by a man named Mr. Hoare, and I could tell you 8 or 10 Hoare jokes about about Mr. Hoare. They're spelled H-O-A-R-E. And Mr. Houghton went to Mr. Hoare and said, look, you've got the same problems I have. The union's after you. Everything's so expensive here. He said, I've got a deal for you. He said, you need high-quality lead blanks to cut, and I make that.
Yep.
So if you come to Corning with me, I'll have a customer for sure, and you'll have the blanks. And I think that was just absolutely brilliant. But what it brought to Corning that we didn't talk about is the cut glass business. And it was the cut glass business who was running out of blanks because Corning stopped making them. It was Mr. Hawks of the cut glass that brought Fred Carter here. So there's a lot of story left.
Absolutely.
No time, so thank you.
Thank you
you
so
very
much.
much. Yeah.
This was great.